Every farmer in Frost Willow Valley had a plan to fight the beetle infestation. Silas Granger sprayed chemicals by the barrel. Old Pete Murchison pulled infected plants by hand for 3 weeks straight. The Hendersons just gave up and sold. But Maeve Holloway did something nobody expected. She spent their last $42 on 63 half-blind ducks that could barely walk in a straight line. Her neighbors didn't just doubt her. They laughed until their sides hurt. They called her farm the circus. What they didn't know was that Maeve had already figured out something the rest of them couldn't see. And before that summer ended, every single one of them would have to admit it. If you're watching this story unfold, hit that like button and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The morning the Beatles came, Rhett Holloway was fixing a fence post at the eastern edge of the lower field when he found the first cluster. He almost didn't notice it. He'd crouched down to dig out a rotted baseboard, and there it was, a patch of soil about the size of his palm, dark and riddled with tiny amber-colored eggs packed in tight rows like something deliberate, like something planned. He pressed his thumb into the dirt and lifted it to his face. The eggs didn't move, but they were everywhere in that patch, hundreds of them, so small you'd miss them if you weren't already on your knees looking for something else. He stood up and looked out across the field. 40 acres of potato plants stretched in long rows toward the tree line, green and chest-high after a wet spring. It had been a good growing season, better than the previous 2 years, which had nearly broken them both. The soil in Frost Willow Valley was heavy and cold, and potatoes were stubborn work. You didn't just plant them and walk away. You amended the soil, you watched the moisture levels, you checked the leaves for curl and blight, and the 100 other things that could kill a crop before it was ever worth $1. Rhett and Maeve had done all of it. They'd worked the land the way they'd worked everything since taking over the Holloway family farm 4 years ago, carefully, without any margin for error, because there was no margin. There never had been. He left the fence post and walked 3 rows deeper into the field. He crouched again. More eggs. A different cluster, same amber color, same tight arrangement. He moved to the next row, then the next. By the time he'd covered a quarter of the lower field, he'd found 11 separate clusters, and the feeling in his gut had gone from mild concern to something heavier and colder. He went back to the house. Maeve was at the kitchen table with a seed catalog open and a mug of coffee going cold at her elbow. She had a pencil behind one ear and a smudge of dirt on her jaw she probably didn't know was there. She looked up when he came in. "You're done with the fence already?" "No." He sat down across from her and set the sample he'd collected on the table between them. A small clump of soil wrapped in his handkerchief, the eggs still visible in the crease of the cloth. "Take a look at that." She leaned forward, picked up the cloth, turned it toward the window light. He watched her face change, the small furrow between her brows, the way her jaw tightened slightly. She'd grown up farming too, on her family's place in the next county, and she knew what bad news looked like before you even named it. "Where?" "Lower East Field. 11 clusters in maybe a quarter acre. Probably more I didn't find." She set the cloth down carefully. "How far along are they?" "Can't tell exactly. A few days out, maybe less. Soil temperature's been climbing all week." She was quiet for a moment, turning her mug in a slow circle on the table. Outside, a crow landed on the fence rail and sat there without making a sound, which felt like the wrong kind of omen. "I'll go look," she said. "Maeve, I know." She stood up. "I know what it means. I just want to see it myself." They spent the rest of that morning in the field together, working methodically from the east edge inward, and by noon they had a clearer picture, and it was worse than Rhett had feared. The clusters weren't isolated to the lower field. They'd found them in the midsection too, scattered but present, and in 2 spots along the northern rise where the soil drained slower and held warmth longer. Exactly the kind of microenvironment certain beetle species preferred for hatching. They sat at the edge of the field and ate sandwiches without much appetite. "Coloradans," Maeve said. She meant Colorado potato beetles, though what they were looking at wasn't quite the same species. This strain had come down from somewhere further north, maybe carried in with a seed shipment 2 seasons back, and it had been spreading through the valley in a slow, quiet creep that most farmers had either missed or refused to worry about. The Valley Extension Office had sent out a notice in March. Most people had filed it and forgotten it. Rhett had not forgotten it. He'd read it twice and then made himself stop reading it because the recommended response, systemic pesticide applications starting at first egg detection, repeated every 5 to 7 days through the full hatch cycle, was going to cost more than they had. "We can't afford the chemical program," he said. Not accusatory, just a fact stated plainly. "I know that. We could try the manual approach. We'll pull infected plants, hand-pick larvae. 40 acres, Rhett. With 2 of us." "I know." The crow was gone from the fence rail. A thin line of cloud was moving across the mountain ridge to the west. The valley was quiet in that particular way it got in late spring, before the summer insects started, when the only sound was wind moving through the potato leaves with a soft, papery rustling. "We could ask the bank about extending the line," Rhett said. Maeve looked at him. "I know," he said again. The bank had already been patient. Longer than most banks would have been, honestly, because of the relationship his father had built there over 30 years. But they were at the edge of what patience could reasonably cover, and showing up to ask for more credit against a crop that was now sitting on top of a beetle infestation, before harvest, before they'd proven the season, was not a conversation either of them wanted to have. "Let me think," she said. "How long do we have before they hatch?" "The early clusters? 4 days. Maybe 5 if the nights stay cold." He nodded. "I'll call over to Pete's this afternoon. See what he's doing." "Pete's already spraying. I saw his rig out on the road 2 days ago." "Maybe he'll share some of what he's using." Maeve's expression didn't change, but something in her eyes shifted. That particular look she got when she'd already thought through something 3 steps further than where the conversation currently was. She didn't say anything else. She just folded up the wax paper from her sandwich and put it in her pocket and stood up. "I want to drive into town this afternoon," she said. "What for?" "I saw an ad in the Frost Willow Gazette last week. I want to go look at something." "Maeve, it won't cost us anything to look." The ad in the Frost Willow Gazette had appeared on page 7, wedged between a notice for a church rummage sale and a column of used equipment listings. It was small, maybe 3 inches of space, and it read, "Ducks for sale. 63 head, mixed breed, partially sighted, cannot keep, must go. Will accept offers. Contact Wendell Farr, RR2, South County Line." Maeve had torn it out and kept it in her coat pocket for 4 days without telling Rhett why. Wendell Farr's place was 14 miles down the valley on a rutted county road that turned to loose gravel after the second bridge. His property was a scraggly operation. A collapsing barn, a house that needed paint, and a wide muddy enclosure near the road where the ducks were kept. Maeve pulled the truck up to the fence and they sat for a moment looking at the flock. 63 ducks. Rhett would count them later, twice, because he wanted to be sure he was seeing what he thought he was seeing. They were a mixed lot, mostly khaki-colored, some darker, a few with pale patches on their heads. They moved around the enclosure in the loose, wobbling way ducks did, but there was something different about them. Several of them moved their heads in an odd, scanning motion, side to side, slow and deliberate, like they were searching for something they couldn't quite locate. A few walked into the fence before correcting course. One sat alone against the far post, turning its head in slow quarter circles at nothing. Partially sighted, the ad had said. "Maeve," Rhett said, "just come look at them with me." Wendell Farr came out of the barn when he heard the truck, and he was not a man who oversold his inventory. He was 70-something, lean, with a face like dry creek bed, and he walked up to the fence beside them and said, "They ain't much to look at. I'll grant you that." "What happened to their eyes?" Maeve asked. "Born that way, most of them. Got a bad breeding batch 3 years back. Vitamin deficiency in the feed," the vet figured. "They can see some. Light and shadow, mostly. Close shapes if they're big enough. They're not blind, just compromised." "Do they forage?" Maeve asked. Wendell looked at her like the question surprised him. "Well, yeah. More than most, actually. Can't rely on their eyes for much, so they use their bills a lot more than a regular duck. Root around in the ground something fierce. I've had them clear slugs and larvae out of my kitchen garden faster than—" He stopped, scratched the back of his neck. "Why do you ask?" "What are you asking for them?" "I take $40 for the lot. Feed's costing me, and they don't give much egg." Rhett said nothing. He was calculating. $40 was almost everything they had liquid right now, Sab, not counting the emergency envelope Maeve kept in the kitchen drawer, which they had a standing agreement not to touch unless the farm itself was in immediate danger of failing. Whether this counted as that kind of moment was a question he was turning over quietly. Maeve said, "I'll give you 42. Wendell blinked. "You don't have to do that." "I know." She pulled the money from her coat pocket, the 40 from their account, and $2 extra that she'd been keeping separately, which told Rhett she'd already made this decision before they left the house. But those ducks are worth it. They loaded the ducks into the truck bed with 3 borrowed crates and drove home in near silence. The ducks were noisy, a steady, low-grade quacking that filled the cab through the rear window, and Rhett kept both hands on the wheel and his eyes on the road. After about 5 miles, he said, "You want to tell me what you're thinking?" "I've been reading about pest control," Maeve said. "Old methods, before the chemical programs. There used to be farmers in Asia, rice farmers mostly, who kept ducks in their paddies specifically to eat larvae. The ducks didn't damage the plants because the plants were tall enough, and the duck bills were too broad to strip the leaves. They just worked the soil and the base of the plants. Potatoes aren't rice paddies? No. But the principle is the same if you design the space right." Rhett was quiet for a moment. "And the partially sighted thing?" "They rely on bill foraging more than sighted ducks. They're better at rooting larvae out of the soil rather than going after surface insects that require tracking by sight. The beetle eggs are in the soil, Rhett. In the top 2 inches, right where those ducks will work naturally." He thought about this. Outside the truck, the valley road ran between fenced pastures and woodlots, the mountains gray-blue in the late afternoon haze. They passed Pete Murchison's place and could see the spray rig parked beside his barn, the smell of chemicals faint even through closed windows. "The rows are too wide," Rhett said finally. "The ducks will spread out and we'll lose half of them in the field. That's why we need to build lanes." "What kind of lanes?" "Willow branches. We have enough along the creek. We stake them down every few feet and create a channel that's narrow enough to guide them through the rows. They can't see well enough to escape the channel if it's dense enough on both sides, so they just follow it forward, row by row." He turned this over for a long time, long enough that Maeve stopped watching him and looked out the side window at the passing fields, patient in the particular way she was when she'd already arrived at a conclusion and was just waiting for the rest of the world to catch up. "Pete's going to say we've lost our minds," Rhett said. "Pete's spending $600 on pesticide that'll get in the groundwater and probably only work on 60% of the infestation anyway. Silas Granger is going to drive past here every day just to watch us fail." "Silas Granger drives past here every day anyway." A long pause. $42, he said. "That was the emergency envelope." "I know." "Maeve." "I know, Rhett. I know exactly what I spent." He blew out a slow breath. One of the ducks in the truck bed let out a particularly emphatic quack, as if punctuating the conversation. Despite everything, Rhett almost smiled. "We're going to need a lot of willow branches," he said. They didn't sleep much that first night. Maeve was up past midnight at the kitchen table with graph paper, sketching the field layout and calculating lane dimensions. Rhett sat across from her with a mug of tea, asking questions, raising problems, letting her work through them aloud because that was how she thought best. Not in silence, but in the friction of being questioned. How wide did the lanes need to be for a duck to move comfortably without turning around? Wide enough for 2 ducks abreast, she figured, about 18 inches. How far apart between willow stakes to prevent gaps a duck could slip through? Every 16 inches, maximum. How many linear feet of lane would they need to cover the whole field? She did the math twice. They needed roughly 800 feet of lane for the lower and midfields, the highest priority areas. At 20 stakes per 30 feet of lane, accounting for corners and junction points, they were looking at close to 600 individual stakes, each one cut, sharpened, and driven by hand. 2 days of cutting if we start tomorrow morning, Rhett said, and another day and a half to drive them all in. We have 4 days before the earliest clusters hatch. It'll be close. It'll be tight, she agreed, but close enough. She looked up from the graph paper. There were circles under her eyes, and a strand of hair had come loose from her braid and was hanging beside her jaw. In the kitchen light, she looked tired and stubborn in equal measure, which was pretty much how she'd looked at every hard moment since he'd known her. "If it doesn't work," he said, "it'll work. If it doesn't, Rhett." She said it quietly, not harshly. "I'm not doing this on a guess. I've been thinking about this since I read the Beetle notice in March. I've been reading about it. I wrote 2 letters to an agricultural extension program in the Northwest asking about duck integration methods, and they both wrote back. I have the letters." She paused. "I didn't tell you because I didn't have everything figured out yet, and I didn't want to bring you a half-formed idea." He looked at her for a moment. "You've been sitting on this since March. Since I saw the ad in the Gazette last week, it became a real plan instead of just a theory. And the ducks being half-blind is the part that makes it work for potato fields specifically. A fully sighted duck in an open field is going to go after whatever it can see, surface beetles, plants, anything that moves. These ducks have adapted to rooting. They'll work the soil without as much plant damage. They're not a defect, Rhett. They're the right tool for exactly this problem." He was quiet for a moment, looking down at her sketches. The field layout in pencil, the carefully measured lanes, the arrows showing duck movement from entry points to exit channels at the far end. It was methodical. It was the work of someone who had thought through every objection and answered it before anyone could raise it. "All right," he said. "All right. Let's build the lanes." Word got around Frost Willow Valley fast, because it always did. By the second morning of lane construction, when Rhett and Maeve were both hip-deep in the lower field, driving willow stakes into the hard ground with a post mallet, a truck had slowed on the county road, and the driver had rolled down his window to look. By the third morning, there were 2 trucks. By the afternoon of the 4th day, the day before the earliest clusters were predicted to hatch, there were 4 vehicles parked along the road shoulder and a small group of men standing at the field fence watching. Silas Granger was one of them. Silas was 61 years old and had been farming Frost Willow Valley for nearly 4 decades. He'd inherited his father's 400 acres and expanded it to nearly 800 through careful management and 2 strategic land purchases. And he had the particular confidence of a man who'd been right about things often enough to stop questioning whether he was right. He wasn't cruel exactly. He just had a way of saying what he thought without filtering it through consideration of how it landed. He was standing at the fence in his good wool jacket, the one he wore to county meetings, which meant he'd come here on purpose, not just passing through. "Holloway!" he called out when Rhett came up to retrieve more stakes from the truck. Rhett straightened. "Silas? What in the devil are you building out there?" "Duck lanes." A short silence from the group at the fence. Then one of the other men, Rhett thought it was Tommy Ferris from the north end of the valley, made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh, which was somehow worse. "Duck lanes," Silas repeated, "for those blind ducks I've been hearing about. They're not fully blind. I heard Maeve Holloway spent the last of your emergency fund on 63 ducks that walk into walls." Rhett kept his voice level. "She spent it on a pest control solution that doesn't require $600 in chemicals we can't afford. Son, I've been farming this valley for nearly 40 years, and I have never heard of anyone using partially sighted ducks to control a Colorado beetle infestation." Silas's voice wasn't raised. He said it like a reasonable man stating an obvious thing. "You've got 4 days, maybe 5, before those eggs hatch. You're out here hammering sticks in the ground. Your wife has got ducks in the barn that can barely see the side of a building. You understand what I'm telling you?" "I understand what you're saying, Silas. You're going to lose your crop." "That's possible. More than possible. It's close to certain." Rhett picked up his bundle of stakes. He'd been awake since 4 in the morning. His shoulders ached and his hands were blistered from 2 days of post-work, and he had roughly 300 more stakes to drive before tomorrow. He did not have the energy or the patience for this conversation, but he also knew better than to make Silas Granger into an enemy when they still had a fall season ahead of them and might need goodwill from neighboring farms before the year was out. "We appreciate the concern," Rhett said. "I need to get back to work." From the field, Maeve had straightened up and was watching the fence line. She didn't say anything. She just turned back to her stake and drove it home with 2 clean swings of the mallet. By that evening, the lane system in the lower field was finished, not elegantly. The willow stakes weren't uniform. Some lanes ran slightly crooked where the soil had resisted them, and there was a stretch near the eastern junction where they'd run short of branches and had to improvise with some old fencing wire to close a gap. But the structure worked. Rhett walked the length of it twice in the fading light, and found only 2 places that needed reinforcement, which he fixed with a handful of extra stakes. Maeve was in the duck pen, sitting on an overturned crate in the last daylight, watching the flock settle. 63 ducks in their temporary pen behind the barn, a makeshift enclosure of chicken wire and wooden pallets they'd assembled in a day. The ducks moved around it in their loose, searching way, their bills constantly working the ground, heads swaying. They'd adapted to the pen faster than Rhett expected. They'd learned the wire boundaries quickly, probably because their compromised vision made them pay closer attention to physical obstacles than a sighted flock would. He sat down beside Maeve. "Tomorrow," she said. "You're not nervous?" "Of course I'm nervous." "You don't look nervous." "I'm very good at not looking nervous." He leaned his forearms on his knees and looked out at the flock. One duck near the back was methodically working a 2-foot circle in the dirt, over and over, slow and thorough, as if it had found something worth investigating and had decided not to leave until it was satisfied. "They're strange animals," Rhett said. "They're perfect," Maeve said. "For this exact thing, they're exactly what we need." He thought about the 4 years they'd been out here. The first year, when they'd lost the corn to late frost and had to borrow against the equipment to cover expenses. The second year, when the tractor needed a new engine block at the worst possible time. The third year, when things had almost leveled out, and they'd let themselves start to believe the hard part was behind them. And now this, beetles in the soil, 40 acres at risk, and 63 half-blind ducks as their best available answer. It wasn't the farming life he'd imagined when they'd first signed the papers on this place. But sitting here beside Maeve in the last light, with the ducks moving quiet and purposeful in their enclosure and the valley settling into dark around them, he thought it was close to the life he actually wanted. "Get some sleep," he said. "I will," she said. "In a minute." He left her there and went inside to start dinner. Through the kitchen window he could still see her out by the pen, sitting on the crate in the near dark, watching her ducks. Thinking. Always thinking. The valley was very quiet. 4 days until the eggs began to hatch. The morning they opened the lane system for the first time, Tommy Ferris drove past the field road 3 times in 90 minutes. Maeve saw him on the second pass but didn't mention it to Rhett. She was focused on guiding the ducks from the temporary pen into the first entry channel of the lane system, a wider mouth at the field's edge that narrowed gradually into the first lane, designed to funnel the flock forward rather than letting them scatter. It didn't work perfectly. Nothing worked perfectly on its first run. 7 ducks turned around in the entry channel and went back to the pen before Rhett cut them off. 4 ducks sat down in the mouth of the channel and refused to move until Maeve clapped her hands twice, which, by pure accident, turned out to be a sound the flock responded to. She filed that away. 2 ducks found a gap in the east wall of the channel and had to be retrieved from the potato rows by hand, walking through the plants with their bills dragging along the soil in exactly the way she hoped they would eventually do by design. But the rest of them, 51 ducks, working their way down the first lane in a loose and shuffling train, moved forward. They were slow. They worked every inch of ground they covered. Their bills went into the soil constantly, rooting and tilting and probing in that deep, thorough way that sighted ducks didn't bother with because sighted ducks could spot surface targets from a distance and move to them directly. These ducks couldn't do that. So they did the other thing. They worked the ground systematically, inch by inch, turning over the top layer of soil with a patience and thoroughness that made Maeve's chest ache a little to watch. In the first lane, at the point where the heaviest egg cluster had been found, one of the larger ducks stopped and began to work a small area with increasing intensity, its bill churning the dirt, and within 90 seconds 4 more ducks had converged on the same spot. Rhett was watching from the lane edge. "They found one," he said. "I know," Maeve said. She didn't say anything else, she just watched. By afternoon, the ducks had worked through the first 3 lanes of the lower field. Maeve had found 3 egg clusters destroyed, the soil around them disturbed and searched. No larvae present. Rhett had marked the spots with small flags. He came up beside her at the edge of the field as the sun started its downward arc toward the ridge. "It's working," he said. "It's starting to work," she said. "There's a difference." But she was smiling. Just slightly, and mostly to herself. Not the kind of smile you show the world, but the kind you get when something you spent months thinking about in the small hours of the night begins to behave exactly the way the math said it would. On the county road, another truck had slowed to a stop. The driver's window was down. Maeve could see the reflection of her field in his windshield, the long rows of potato plants, the thin lines of willow stakes, and somewhere in there, invisible from the road, 63 unlikely ducks going carefully about their work. She turned her back on the road. There was still the midfield to prepare before tomorrow, and the northern rise after that, and the egg cycle wouldn't wait for anyone. She picked up her mallet and went back to work. The second day of the beetle hatch was worse than the first. Maeve had expected that. The egg clusters didn't all open at once. They came in waves, triggered by soil temperature and moisture, the early clusters going first and the deeper, cooler ones following 2 and 3 days behind. She'd mapped the clusters as best she could during their survey, and she'd planned the lane schedule around the predicted sequence. But prediction and reality had a way of diverging when you were dealing with living things in living ground. And by mid-morning of the second day, it was clear the hatch was running faster than her estimates. She was in the midfield when Rhett found her, moving quickly between lanes with a small wire flag in each hand, marking fresh emergent sites where the larvae had already broken surface. The ducks were behind her in lanes 3 and 4, working steadily, but she was 50 yards ahead of them and the gap was growing. "How bad?" Rhett said. "The northern clusters are opening early. The soil temperature up on the rise must have spiked overnight. We had that warm wind come through around 2 in the morning, remember?" He remembered. He'd been awake for it. "We need to push the flock faster," she said. "You can't push them faster. They stop working if you rush them. You said that yourself." "I know what I said." She was moving as she talked, crouching to check a section of soil between rows, straightening, moving to the next. "I'm not saying run them through. I'm saying we split the flock. Half in the midfield lanes, half in the lower lanes to clear the already hatched sections before the second wave comes through." "We've never split them before." "I know." He was quiet for a beat. "Will they tolerate it?" "They're going to have to." They split the flock that afternoon, which was easier said than done. Ducks, it turned out, did not appreciate being divided from the rest of their number. The first attempt produced 20 minutes of confused circling near the entry channels, 6 ducks sitting down in protest, and one particularly stubborn bird that Rhett had to carry bodily to the midfield entrance before it would consent to move in the right direction. Maeve used the double clap, the accidental signal she'd discovered on the first day, to reassert order, and slowly, grudgingly, the two groups separated and began to work their respective lanes. It wasn't elegant, but by late afternoon, both groups were moving. Rhett walked the perimeter of the lower field while the first group worked and counted larvae on the soil surface. There were fewer than he'd seen that morning. Measurably, visibly fewer. The ducks weren't clearing everything. There were still active larvae in the sections they hadn't reached yet. But in every lane the flock had passed through, the larval count was low enough to notice. He didn't tell Maeve. She was too busy to stop, and he didn't want to say it out loud yet, like naming something early might break it. The rain started on the third evening, not the soft, useful rain that the valley occasionally got in late spring, the kind that settled into the soil overnight and left everything bright and fresh by morning. This was heavier, driven sideways by a wind off the mountains, the kind of rain that turned the field roads to mud in 3 hours and made every outdoor task twice as hard and half as effective. Maeve stood at the barn door and looked at it. "We can't run them in this," Rhett said from behind her. "The lanes will flood if it keeps up. The willow stakes on the lower section are already sitting in soft ground. They'll pull loose. We can redrive them tomorrow." Tomorrow the second hatch wave hits the northern rise. Rhett came and stood beside her at the doorway. The rain came down in sheets across the dark field, and the sound of it on the barn roof was loud enough that they had to pitch their voices up to talk. The ducks, penned in the dry section of the barn, were quieter than usual. The noise seemed to settle them, or maybe just dull them. A few of them had tucked their heads under their wings. "4 stakes pulled loose in the east section," he said. "I checked before I came in." "How many?" "4 that I found. Probably more I didn't." She turned away from the door and went to the small workbench along the barn wall where she kept her field notes, a worn composition notebook with a rubber band around it, the pages swollen slightly from having been left out in damp air too many times. She opened it to her hatch schedule and studied it in the thin light. "If we lose tomorrow," she said, "we can't recover the northern rise in time. The second wave will be 3 days into active larval feeding by the time we get ducks up there. Then we get up before dawn and redrive every stake that needs it. In this rain, the rain won't last all night. He said it with more confidence than he felt, which she probably knew, but she let it pass. All right, she closed the notebook. Wake me at 4. I'll set the alarm for 3:30. Why 3:30? Because it'll take you 20 minutes to actually get out of bed. She gave him a flat look. He kept his face straight. After a moment, she sat down on a hay bale and pulled off one boot to pour the water out of it, and he went to check the duck enclosure one more time before turning in. Outside, across the county road, a light was on in Silas Granger's kitchen. Silas had not driven past the Holloway farm since the first day. He'd made his position clear to anyone who asked. He thought Maeve's plan was going to end with a ruined crop and a ruined farm, and he didn't see the value in watching that happen slowly when he had 800 acres of his own to worry about. His own fields were treated and covered. His pest situation was managed. He had no stake in whether their circus experiment worked or didn't. That was what he told himself. But he'd heard the talk in town. He'd been at Hattie's counter at the feed store 2 days ago when Tommy Ferris had mentioned, with the particular careful casualness of a man trying not to seem too interested, that the ducks were actually moving through the Holloway fields in some kind of organized system, that the lanes were holding, that there seemed to be fewer larvae in the treated sections. Silas had not responded to this. He'd paid for his order and carried it to his truck and driven home. But the conversation had stayed with him in a way he didn't entirely welcome. His wife, Dora, noticed him standing at the kitchen window past midnight, looking at nothing in particular. "Come to bed," she said. "In a minute." "You've been standing there for an hour, Silas." "I have not." "Close enough." She came and stood beside him. Outside the window, the rain was heavy on the yard and the dark fields beyond. "This is about the Holloways." "It's about the rain," he said. "I'm checking the drainage on the south field." "You checked the drainage on the south field before dinner." She looked at his profile. "You're thinking about whether she's right." He didn't answer. "It's okay to not know," Dora said. "I told Rhett he was going to lose his crop." "You told him what you believed." "I told him in front of 6 other men." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Well, the season's not over." Silas said nothing. Outside, the rain drove hard against the glass, and far down the valley, a light was still burning in the Holloway barn. By 4:15 in the morning, Rhett and Maeve were both in the lower field in the rain. It was still dark, the kind of dark that pressed right up to the edge of the lantern light and gave you nothing beyond it. The rain had eased to a steady drizzle rather than the hard driving sheets of the evening, and the ground was saturated but not underwater. They moved along the damaged section of the east lane, checking each stake, redriving the ones that had worked loose, replacing 2 that had snapped at the base where the wood had been too thin. Maeve did it mostly without talking. She had a way of working in the dark and the cold that Rhett admired and sometimes found slightly unnerving. A focused, internal quality that made her seem entirely self-sufficient, like she could do this alone if she had to, like she might have to, and she'd already accepted that. "You know what Tommy Ferris is going to say when he finds out we were out here at 4 in the morning fixing stakes in the rain," Rhett said, driving a stake with 3 hard swings. "Tommy Ferris," Maeve said, "is going to say whatever makes a good story. He told Pete Murchison we were keeping the ducks in our bedroom." "We're not." "I know we're not. We almost did that first night when the pen wasn't finished." "Maeve." "I'm just saying." She handed him the next stake. "Drive it deeper this time, 6 inches minimum." He drove it deeper. The mallet rang out in the wet dark, loud and repetitive, and somewhere in the barn the ducks stirred at the sound. 50 yards down the lane, Rhett could hear them shifting, the low, constant murmur of the flock, which he'd started to find almost comforting in its regularity. They were alive. They were here. That was something. "Do you regret it?" he asked. Maeve crouched to test a stake's depth with her hand before moving to the next. "Regret what specifically?" "Any of it. The ducks, the money. Doing it this way instead of just trying to borrow from the bank or selling a section or some less visible approach." She considered this. It was one of the things he valued about her. She didn't answer quickly when a question deserved more than a quick answer. "I regret the part where Silas Granger said it in front of 6 people," she said. "I don't regret the decision." Even if it doesn't work? She stood up and looked at him through the drizzle. The lantern light made her face sharp-edged and serious. There was mud on her coat from the knee down, and her hair was wet under the hood of her slicker. If it doesn't work, she said, it won't be because the idea was wrong. It'll be because we ran out of time, or ran out of capacity, or the weather beat us. She turned back to the stake line. Those are different things. They're not so different when you've lost the crop either way. They are to me. He thought about that for a while, working alongside her in the rain, and decided she was right. Not in a way that made him feel better exactly. The practical outcomes were still the same regardless of who was right, but right in the sense that she was talking about something other than practicality. She was talking about the difference between failing because you were wrong and failing because the world didn't cooperate. One of those things you could live with easier than the other. By 6:30, all the stakes were redriven and the lane system was intact. They went inside, changed into dry clothes, and Maeve made eggs while Rhett made coffee. They ate without talking much, the way people eat when they're tired enough that conversation takes more energy than it's worth. The kitchen window was gray with early morning light, the rain still falling but softer now. The fields outside quiet and soaked. The mockery reached a new level that week, and it came from a direction they hadn't anticipated. Clyde Marsh, who ran the small weekly Frost Willow agricultural newsletter that circulated to maybe 80 farm subscribers in the valley, published a half-column item on Thursday. He didn't use their names, just referred to a local farm operation. But everyone who read it knew exactly who he meant. The piece was written in a tone of careful amusement, the kind of writing that wasn't openly cruel but landed cruel anyway. It described the duck lane system in detail, including several inaccuracies that made it sound more chaotic than it was, and ended with a line about how unconventional pest management methods often say more about desperation than innovation. Rhett read it at the kitchen table and set it face down without finishing. Maeve read it standing at the counter all the way through, then folded it neatly and put it in the drawer where she kept receipts. He misspelled larvae, she said. That's what you got from that? He also said we had 40 ducks. We have 63. He couldn't even get the basic facts right. She closed the drawer. So I'm not going to lose sleep over his opinion on agricultural science. People are going to read that. People are going to read it, and then they're going to watch and see what actually happens. That's how it works. She poured herself coffee. I'm more worried about the Northern Rise than Clyde Marsh's newsletter. The Northern Rise was, in fact, the problem. The terrain there was different from the lower and midfields, sloped with heavier clay soil that drained poorly after rain and made stake driving significantly harder. The lane system she'd designed for it was more complex, with 3 junction points where lanes branched to accommodate the slope, and the branch junctions were the most labor-intensive parts of the whole structure. She'd been putting off building them while they stabilized the lower field, but with the second hatch wave coming in on schedule, she couldn't delay any longer. They started on the Northern Rise stakes that same afternoon. The clay soil fought them every inch. Rhett blistered his right palm through his work gloves on the first hour of driving, and by early evening, both of them were moving slowly, their arms burning, working in near silence because there wasn't energy left over for talking. Maeve drove stakes with a grim, mechanical consistency. Not elegant, not powerful, just relentless. She'd reach for the next stake from the bundle, position it, 2 swings to set it, 3 more to drive it to depth, test it with one hand, move to the next. Over and over. For hours. Rhett watched her at one point from 10 feet away, just stopped, and watched for a moment without her knowing, and felt something he couldn't have named exactly. Not pity, not admiration, though it was close to that. Something closer to the particular ache you feel when you see a person you love working at the edge of what they have left and refusing to stop. He went back to his own stake line. But by Friday evening, the Northern Rise system was built. They moved the first group of ducks up to it the following morning, and that was when they hit a problem they hadn't planned for. The slope. Ducks, as it turned out, were not natural hill climbers. On flat ground, the flock moved forward with reasonable consistency through the lanes, following the physical boundary of the willow stake walls. On a slope, even a moderate one, the whole dynamic shifted. Ducks that couldn't see well enough to judge incline kept trying to turn sideways across the slope rather than moving uphill. The stake walls that worked fine on flat ground weren't deep enough to overcome gravity-driven side slip on a grade. Within 20 minutes of opening the northern rise lanes, they had a third of the flock sitting down in protest on the hillside, and another group that had bunched up at the first junction and refused to sort into the branch lanes. "This isn't working," Rhett said. "I can see that," Maeve said. "We need to redesign the junctions." "I know." She was already walking the slope, looking at the terrain, her eyes moving fast. "The branch angles are too sharp. On flat ground they work because the ducks just follow the wall. On a slope they're fighting the angle and the grade at the same time." She stopped, turned, looked at the junctions. "We need to curve them. Instead of sharp branch angles, curve them gradually so the ducks are already turning before they hit the branch point. That's another day of work. Half a day if we work fast." "Maeve, we don't have half a day," she said again, flat and certain. "Go get the extra stakes from the truck." He stood there for a moment. His hand was still blistered from yesterday. His back had been tight since the morning, and he'd said nothing about it. He thought about Clyde Marsh's newsletter and Silas Granger at the fence in his good jacket, and Tommy Ferris driving past 3 times, and the $42 that was no longer in the emergency envelope. He went to get the stakes. They rebuilt the junction curves in 4 hours, working fast and not quite right in a few spots. One curve came out tighter than intended and needed to be widened by resetting 3 stakes, and there was a section near the top of the rise where they'd run short of willow branches and had to use cedar, which didn't flex the same way. But when they ran the ducks through the revised system that afternoon, something different happened. The flock moved up the slope, slowly, with stops and the usual complaints, and 2 ducks who needed individual persuasion. But they moved, and they worked as they moved, their bills in the clay soil, rooting and probing, and at the first larval cluster on the northern rise, a deep one, packed in the cold clay 15 inches below grade, a group of 6 ducks stopped and worked it together with an intensity that was almost startling to watch. Rhett stood at the edge of the rise and watched them. His back hurt. His hand hurt. He was tired in a bone-deep way that sleep hadn't quite been fixing all week. He didn't say anything. Neither did Maeve. They just stood there on the slope in the afternoon light and watched the blind ducks work. And the valley spread out below them, green and enormous, and somewhere down the road Silas Granger's 800 acres sat treated and sprayed and certain, and none of that mattered particularly right now. What mattered was this. The larvae were there, and the ducks had found them, and the work was happening whether or not anyone watching from a road believed it would. That was enough. For now, that was enough. The northern rise cleared out on a Tuesday. Maeve walked the top section in the early afternoon, checking the clay soil between rows with a narrow hand probe she'd made from a sharpened piece of rebar, and what she found, or rather, what she didn't find, was the closest thing to relief she'd allowed herself to feel in 2 weeks. Larval counts in the treated lanes were down to near 0. The clusters she'd marked with flags were gone, the soil around them disturbed and emptied, the beetles not dead exactly, but moved through the food chain in the particular efficient way that happened when ducks were involved. The plants on the northern rise stood clean and upright, none of the telltale leaf curl or stippling that signaled active larval feeding damage. She didn't celebrate. She made a note in the composition book and moved to the next section. But that evening, when she and Rhett sat on the porch after dinner, and the sky went pink and orange over the western ridge, she told him what she'd found, and he sat with it for a long moment before saying anything. "All of it?" he said. "Everything the ducks have been through, lower field, midsection, northern rise. And the plants? Healthy, all of them." He leaned back in his chair and looked at the sky. He had a beer going warm in his hand and hadn't touched it in a while. "We're going to make it," he said. Not triumphant, more like a man who'd been holding his breath for 2 weeks and was just starting to believe he could let it out. "We're going to make it if the third hatch wave doesn't surprise us," Maeve said, "and if we can keep the lane system intact through the rest of the season. You can't just take the win for 1 minute." "I'm taking it," she said. "I'm taking it and also noting the remaining variables." He shook his head slowly and finally drank his beer. Across the valley, the lights were starting to come on in the farmhouses along the county road. And somewhere in the middle distance, a dog was barking at something in the dark, and the night was coming on soft and cool. Maeve pulled her jacket tighter and looked out at the dark shape of the fields below the house and thought about the 63 ducks settling into the barn for the night, each one of them worn out from a day's work, each one of them worth more than anyone in Frost Willow Valley currently believed. She gave herself that. Just that small, private satisfaction. Then she went inside to check the weather report. The fox came on a Thursday night, 12 days into the operation. They never heard it. That was the part that stayed with Rhett afterward. The fact that something that destructive could happen in complete silence while they slept 20 yards away. He'd gone to bed at 10 and been asleep by 10:15, which was fast even for him, because the previous 3 days had been brutal and his body had stopped asking permission before shutting down. Maeve had been asleep beside him before 10. He woke at 5:15 to a sound he couldn't immediately place, a scattered, urgent quality to the duck noise that was different from their usual morning restlessness. He lay still for 3 seconds identifying it. Then he was out of bed. He pulled on boots without socks and grabbed the lantern from the hall and went to the barn at a run. The pen was destroyed. The chicken wire on the south face had been pulled away from 2 of the wooden pallet uprights. Not cut, not broken cleanly, but wrenched and peeled back by something strong and determined. The gap was about 16 inches wide, more than enough. Inside the pen, the remaining ducks were clustered in the far corner in a tight, shaking mass, pressed against each other and the barn wall. Outside, through the gap and across the yard, Rhett could see shapes moving in the dark. Individual ducks scattered across a 40-foot radius, some motionless, some moving in the aimless, panicked way of a bird that had been chased hard and hadn't found its way back yet. He counted quickly. The clustered group in the pen was maybe 35, 40 birds. He couldn't tell in the dark and the chaos. The rest were outside. He started moving without thinking, crossing the yard to the nearest duck, crouching, gathering it up carefully. It was shaking badly and had a small wound on the back of its neck, not deep, just a graze, and it didn't fight him when he picked it up, which was itself worrying because a healthy duck fights. He carried it back to the pen and set it inside the reinforced section near the water trough, then went back out for the next one. Maeve arrived at the pen while he was on his third retrieval, pulling her coat on over her nightclothes, hair loose, eyes already sharp and assessing rather than confused. She took in the damage to the wire, the scattered flock, Rhett crossing the yard with a duck under each arm, and she didn't ask what happened. She went to help. They worked the yard in a widening spiral, finding ducks in the dark by sound and movement. Some of them easy to locate and calm, others harder. One had gotten into the woodpile and wedged itself under the bottom layer of split logs, and it took Maeve 8 minutes on her knees to work it out without injuring it further. 2 were found in the lower kitchen garden, 30 yards from the pen. 1 was under the truck. By 6:30, in this gray early light, they had 51 ducks back in the secured section of the barn. 12 were gone. Rhett stood in the yard and turned in a slow circle, looking. The fields beyond the fence, the tree line at the property edge, the narrow drainage ditch that ran along the county road. They could be anywhere, he said. We'll find them when it's light. Maeve, some of them will come back on their own when they calm down. Ducks have territory instinct. They know this barn. She was already looking at the pen damage, pulling at the bent wire, calculating what it would take to fix it. Her voice was steady, but her hands weren't. A small, tight tremor that she probably wasn't aware of, working the wire back toward the upright. Help me get this closed first. We can't run an open pen. We need to find the other 12. We need to close the pen so the 51 we have don't get out again while we're looking for the 12 we lost. He heard the logic in it and hated it and went to find the wire staples. They had the pen closed by 7. Of the 12 missing ducks, 3 had returned on their own by then, finding their way back to the barn in the way Maeve had predicted. They found 2 more in the ditch along the county road, unhurt and irritable. A 6th turned up at the edge of the lower field at the entry point of lane 1, which struck Rhett as almost funny in a bleak kind of way. Lost, half blind, but headed for work. The remaining 6 were not found that morning, or that afternoon. Rhett drove the county road to the south and walked the tree line twice. He checked the Murchison property line, which abutted their eastern fence. He went back to the woodpile in the kitchen garden and checked every outbuilding. Nothing. By 4 o'clock, he was fairly sure those 6 birds were gone for good, and the way he felt about that surprised him. A genuine, hollow loss that was partly about the numbers and partly about something harder to name. He'd spent 12 days moving those ducks through lanes, listening to them, learning their patterns, and their particular small personalities. The stubborn one who always sat down at junction points. The fast worker in the midfield who could clear a larval cluster in half the time of any other bird. The one that had taken to following Maeve specifically, a step behind her whenever she moved through the pen. He didn't know if that one was still here. He hadn't been able to count carefully enough. He went back to the house without saying anything to Maeve about it. She was at the kitchen table when he came in, but she wasn't looking at the composition book. She was just sitting, both hands around a mug, staring at the middle distance. She looked up when he came through the door. 6? She said. Best I can figure. She nodded. She already knew. She'd been counting, too. He sat across from her. The pen's solid now. 3 reinforced uprights, doubled wire on the south and east faces. It'll hold. That's not the problem, she said. I know. The problem was the lane system. While they'd been retrieving ducks and securing the pen through the night and morning, the fields had been unattended. 6 ducks permanently gone meant the flock was down to 57, which was still workable but changed the math on coverage. And the fox, or foxes possibly, a single animal rarely pulled chicken wire that cleanly, had come through the yard at speed, and a fox that found food once came back. That meant tonight was a risk, and the night after, and every night until the pen was proven against a second attempt. But none of that was the real problem either. The real problem was the lane system, and Maeve was already on it in her head before Rhett had finished sitting down. How much damage? He asked. I walked the lower field while you were checking the road, she said. The flock scattered through there last night. Panicking animals don't follow lanes. They went right through the stake walls in 2 places. I've got about 60 feet of collapsed lane in the lower east section and a junction point that's completely down. That's a morning of work. It's less than a day, yes, but Rhett... She stopped, set down her mug. The 3rd hatch wave. I've been checking the soil temperature readings, and with this weather pattern, I think it's coming earlier than I predicted. Maybe 2 days out. So we have 2 days to repair the lanes and get the flock back on schedule. If I'm right about the timing. Are you usually wrong about the timing? She almost smiled. No? Then we have 2 days. He said it simply, as if 2 days were enough. As if the math worked out. As if they hadn't just lost 6 birds and a night's sleep and a significant section of a lane system they'd spent 4 days building. He said it the way he said most hard things, not with false confidence, but with the particular stubbornness of a man who had decided the alternative wasn't worth considering. Maeve looked at him across the table and felt something loosen slightly in her chest. Not relief, not quite. Just the recognition that she wasn't carrying this alone, which was a thing she sometimes forgot in the concentrated tunnel of her own problem-solving. Go sleep for 2 hours, she said. I'm fine. Rhett, go sleep for 2 hours. I'll start on the lane repair and you'll be more useful to me at noon than you are right now. He wanted to argue. She could see it in his face. But he was also a practical man, and practically speaking, she was right. He was running on fumes, and fumes made for sloppy stake work and counting errors, both of which they couldn't afford. He went to sleep. Maeve put on her coat and went out to the field. The lane repair took until late afternoon. Alone through the morning, she worked the collapsed section methodically, pulling the fallen stakes, resharpening the blunted ones against a flat stone, driving them back in the right positions with the mallet. Her arms ached from the days of accumulated work, but she'd passed the point where aching mattered. It was just a background condition now, like weather. Rhett came out at 11, rested enough to be useful, and took the far end of the damaged section while she worked the junction point. They didn't talk much. They'd gotten efficient at working in near silence over the past 2 weeks, reading each other's pace and progress, adjusting without direction. He'd hand her a stake before she asked for it. She'd move to a new section without announcing it, and he'd follow within a few minutes. It wasn't coordination exactly. It was more worn in than that. By 3, they had the lane system back to operational. By 4, they had the flock moving through the repaired section, and the ducks went in without ceremony, without any apparent awareness of the drama of the previous night, just dropped back into their work as if no time had passed, and nothing had changed. That was something about them that Rhett had noticed early on and never entirely gotten used to. Their total lack of grudge or trauma around the work itself. The fox attack had rattled them badly. In the pen they were still nervy, jumping at sounds. But in the lanes, moving through the soil, working the way they'd been working for nearly 2 weeks, they were simply themselves, focused, purposeful. They don't know what almost happened, Rhett said. No, Maeve said. They just know what they're for. The argument happened on Friday evening, and it was the worst one they'd had in years. It started over something small, a comment Rhett made about the repair work, a particular junction that he thought was set at the wrong angle, and escalated in the way that arguments do when they're not really about what they're about. The junction angle was fine. The argument was about everything else: the exhaustion, the 6 lost ducks, the money, the accumulated weight of 2 weeks at the edge of their capacity, and the fact that they were both people who pushed down fear until it came out sideways. I'm saying it could have been set 3 inches further left, Rhett said. He wasn't raising his voice, but his jaw was tight, which was worse. It's within tolerance, Maeve said. It's marginal. Everything we've built out here is marginal, Rhett. We're farming 40 acres with 2 people and a flock of partially blind ducks, and we're doing it on the narrowest possible margin of everything: money, time, physical capacity, weather. That junction is fine. I'm not criticizing the whole operation. It feels like you are. It feels like... He stopped, pressed his hand flat on the kitchen table. I'm tired, Maeve. I'm really tired, and I'm scared, and I don't know how to say that in a way that doesn't sound like I think this was the wrong call, because I don't think it was the wrong call. He blew out a long breath. 6 ducks. The kitchen was quiet. Outside the window, the evening was going dark. I know, she said. I know you know. I keep thinking about which ones they were, he said, and his voice shifted slightly on it, rougher, quieter. That's the stupid part. I keep trying to figure out which 6. Maeve sat down across from him. She'd been standing through most of the argument, which was her habit. She thought better on her feet. But now she sat, and she put both hands on the table between them. The fast one in the midfield is still here, she said. I checked. And the one who follows me around, she's still in the pen. I've been checking her specifically since yesterday morning. He looked at her. You have? She had a scratch on her right wing from the wire. I cleaned it this morning. She's fine. He was quiet for a moment. Then he put one of his hands over both of hers. I'm sorry about the junction, he said. The junction is fine, she said. But also, I know you're tired and scared. I am too. They sat like that for a while, not saying anything. The house settled around them with its familiar sounds: the creak of the roof beam, the tick of the kitchen clock, the distant muffled murmur of the duck pen from the barn. And outside, the valley went dark and quiet under a sky that had finally cleared after days of cloud, stars appearing one by one over the mountain ridge. The third hatch wave arrived 36 hours later, exactly on Maeve's revised estimate. She found the first emergent signs on Saturday morning in the midfield. Fresh larvae at the soil surface in the section between lanes 4 and 5, the tender yellow-white of newly hatched beetles, still slow and clumsy in the cold of early morning. She didn't panic. She walked back to the barn, loaded the midfield group into their entry channel, and set them moving before breakfast. The ducks hit the emergent site at 9:15. The feeding response was immediate and almost violent in its efficiency. The flock converged on the larvae-rich section with a purposefulness that still managed to surprise her even after nearly 2 weeks of watching them work. The slow, probing bill work she'd come to associate with routine foraging shifted into something faster and more targeted. Multiple birds working overlapping areas, the soil churning constantly, the larvae not lasting long enough to do any meaningful damage to the plants above. By noon, the midfield emergence was contained. Maeve walked the section, probing the soil, checking plants, and found what was becoming a familiar result: treated soil clean and emptied, plants undamaged, the neat, undeniable evidence of work done correctly. She was crouching over a soil sample near the eastern boundary of the lane when she heard a truck on the county road slow down and stop. She didn't look up immediately. She'd gotten used to the trucks. But this one idled for a long time. Long enough that eventually she stood and turned. Silas Granger's truck, sitting on the road shoulder with the engine running. He was visible through the windshield, upright in the driver's seat, looking at the field. Not with the amused tolerance of the first day at the fence. Something different now. He sat there for almost a full minute. Then he put the truck in gear and drove on. Maeve watched him go. She thought about what it meant and then decided she didn't have enough information yet to think about what it meant, and she went back to her soil sample. The third hatch wave was the last large emergence event. She knew that from the temperature data, from the cluster maps she'd made, from the way the hatch cycle ran in this part of the valley. After this wave passed, there would be isolated, smaller emergences, secondary clusters in pockets of deeper soil, the delayed holdouts, but nothing the flock couldn't handle on a normal daily schedule without the intensive lane-by-lane push they'd been doing. She put that in the composition book that evening and looked at it for a long time. They were almost through. Rhett found her on the porch later, the notebook closed on her knee, looking out at the dark field. "You have that look," he said. "What look?" "The one where you're trying not to let yourself believe something yet." She looked at him. "We're almost through the hatch cycle." "I know. If nothing else goes wrong, Maeve, I'm serious. If nothing else goes wrong between now and end of week, I know." He sat down in his chair. "I know what it means." She didn't say the rest of it out loud. That 40 acres of potatoes standing clean and healthy while every other farm in the valley was fighting devastation would be impossible to ignore. That the lane system she'd sketched on graph paper at midnight 3 weeks ago had worked, was working, had done the thing she'd spent months quietly, privately, believing it could do. That 63 half-blind ducks that nobody had wanted had turned out to be exactly the right tool for exactly this problem, and she had seen that when nobody else had. She didn't say any of it. She just looked at the field in the dark, and the stars were bright over the ridge, and the night was clear and cold and very still. Then, from inside the barn, came the low collective murmur of the flock settling, that steady, unhurried sound that had become the background score of the last 3 weeks of their lives. 63 voices, -6, doing the ordinary animal thing of resting after work. She listened to it for a while. Then she went to bed. The morning Maeve decided the lanes were no longer necessary was the same morning she realized something had shifted in the flock that she hadn't planned for and couldn't entirely explain. It was early, barely 6, the light still gray and thin over the eastern ridge, and she'd gone out to open the barn before Rhett was up. Standard routine by now. Unlatch the pen, check water levels, assess the flock's general condition before the day's work started. She did it on autopilot, moving through the familiar steps without much conscious thought. The way you do things, you've done the same way 30 days in a row. But when she opened the pen gate that morning, something different happened. The flock didn't wait. Every other morning for 3 weeks, the ducks had milled around the open gate for a minute or two before the lead birds ventured out and the rest followed in their loose, shuffling way. They needed that transition. From the safety of the enclosed pen to the open yard, then to the lane entry point. It was a process that took time and occasional coaxing. This morning, the flock moved to the gate before she had it fully open, pressing forward with a collective purpose that made her step back. They came through the gate in a tight group, crossed the yard without the usual meandering, and lined up at the entry channel to the lower field as if they'd been given a schedule and intended to keep it. Maeve stood in the yard and watched them. She went to get Rhett. He came out still pulling his jacket on, squinting in the gray light, and she pointed at the flock assembled at the field entry. "They did that on their own," she said. He looked. "Huh. They know where they're going." "I can see that." "Rhett, they've been doing this long enough that they know the job. They know the field. They know the lanes." She paused. "What happens if we open the entry and don't use the lane walls?" He turned to her. "You want to take the lanes down? I want to see if they still work the rows without them. If they scatter, then we put the lanes back up. But look at them." She gestured at the flock, assembled and waiting with an almost impatient energy. "They're not the same animals they were 4 weeks ago. They've learned this." Rhett looked at the ducks for a long moment, then at the lane entry, then back at Maeve. He had the expression he got when he was doing fast mental math on a problem he hadn't had time to fully think through. "1 row," he said finally. "We try it in 1 row without lane walls, and we watch every minute of it." 1 row, she agreed. They pulled the stakes from a single interior row, not one of the edge rows where the ducks might wander off the field entirely, but a central row deep enough in the field that the surrounding planted rows formed a natural corridor. Maeve walked the row twice to check the soil, noted 2 spots with fresh larval activity that would give the flock something specific to find, then came back and opened the entry. The lead duck went in without hesitation. It moved down the row at the same methodical pace they'd been trained to, bill working the soil, pausing at intervals to root more deeply, and the birds behind it followed in the same loose train formation they'd always used in the lanes, except there were no lane walls. Just the open row and the potato plants on either side, tall enough now to form their own soft boundary, and the ducks moving between them as if the walls were still there. Rhett exhaled slowly beside her. "They're tracking the plant rows," he said quietly. "The plants are the lanes," Maeve said. "They always were. We just didn't trust them to see it." She watched the flock work its way down the row for a full 10 minutes before she let herself believe what she was watching. Because this changed something important. This meant the lane infrastructure, all those stakes, all that willow cutting and driving and repair work, the bleary-eyed 4 a.m. sessions in the rain, had been a training structure, not a permanent necessity. The ducks had internalized the task. They didn't need the walls anymore. They just needed the work. "We can cover the whole field now," she said. "All 40 acres, as fast as they can move." How fast can they move without the lanes slowing them? Faster than they've been going, significantly faster. She turned and walked back to the barn to get her notebook. What followed were 2 days that both Rhett and Maeve would talk about for years afterward, though they'd describe them differently. Rhett would talk about the physical reality of it, the dawn to dark work, the aching legs, the way his voice got hoarse from using the whistle so much, the particular quality of exhaustion that set in around the second afternoon when his body stopped complaining and just went quiet because there was nothing left to complain with. Maeve would talk about what she saw, the way the field looked row by row as they moved through it, the evidence accumulating under her feet, the arithmetic of survival playing out in soil and plant, and the tireless work of 57 birds. They split the labor the way they'd learned to over the previous weeks, with minor adjustments for the new approach. Without lane walls to contain the flock, they needed to work as human guides on either side of each section, Rhett on the left boundary, Maeve on the right, both of them using short whistle signals they'd developed through trial and error to keep the flock moving in the right direction and at the right pace. 2 short blasts meant slow down, work the current section more thoroughly. 1 long blast meant move forward. 3 short blasts meant Maeve needed Rhett's help on her side, which happened twice on the first day when 3 ducks decided the kitchen garden was more interesting than the field and had to be redirected. The whistle system was imperfect. Sometimes the ducks responded, sometimes they didn't. Sometimes a section of the flock responded and the rest continued on the wrong vector and had to be physically walked back. It was messy and intermittent and required constant attention, and by mid-morning of the first day Maeve's throat was sore from the whistle and her legs ached from covering the same rows repeatedly at the flock's pace. But the flock worked. Row by row through the first morning, the ducks cleared sections of the lower field that the lane system hadn't been able to reach in its final configuration. Corners, edges, the irregular sections near the creek boundary where the planted rows curved slightly and the willow stake lanes had been hardest to fit. These were exactly the areas Maeve had been most worried about, the pockets where larvae could survive the lane-based approach and emerged late to damage plants that had been healthy all season. Now the ducks were moving through them with the same systematic thoroughness they brought to everything, and the larval count she spot-checked through the morning were the lowest she'd seen. Rhett was shaking plants. This was his contribution to the final push, a technique they'd tried once in the second week and abandoned because the lane walls didn't leave enough room for it, but out in the open field it worked. He moved down the rows just ahead of the main flock body, gripping potato plants at their base and shaking them gently, firmly enough to dislodge any larvae clinging to stems and root junctions, not firmly enough to damage the plant. The larvae fell to the soil. The ducks, following directly behind him, ate them before they could rebury themselves. It was hard, repetitive work. He did it for hours. His hands went numb in the morning cold and stayed stiff through the afternoon even after they warmed up. And there were rows in the midfield where the plants were packed dense enough that reaching the base meant crouching full down with his face close to the soil, which put strain on his lower back that he was going to feel for days. He didn't stop. Around 2 p.m. of the first day, Maeve appeared at the end of his row. "How's the back?" she said. "Fine." You're walking like it's not fine. I said it's fine, Maeve. She looked at him for a moment. She had soil on her face, and her hair had come entirely loose from the braid she'd put it in that morning, and she looked, Rhett thought, like someone who had been doing hard outdoor work for 36 days straight, which was exactly what she was. Take a break for 20 minutes, she said. We don't have 20 minutes. I'll keep the flock in this section. Go eat something and stand up straight for 20 minutes and then come back. He wanted to argue. He looked at the rows still ahead of them, maybe a third of the midfield remaining on this pass, and then at his hands, which were not behaving as reliably as he'd like, missing plants in the shake sequence and having to double back. He took the break. He sat on the tailgate of the truck parked at the field edge and ate a sandwich Maeve had left there that morning. It was slightly stale by now, and he ate it anyway, and drank water and looked at the sky, which had gone a clear, flat blue with thin cirrus clouds high up toward the mountains. A hawk was working a thermal over the south field, turning slow, lazy circles, and he watched it for a few minutes without thinking about anything in particular. The hawk reminded him of his father, not for any logical reason. His father had never talked about hawks or shown any particular interest in them. But his father had farmed this same land for 30 years, and there had been a hawk of some kind that worked this same thermal in the same way every summer for as long as Rhett could remember. And watching it now produced that involuntary sense memory of being a kid on this property, before it was his responsibility when it had just been home. When the problems of the farm were his father's problems, and the land was just land. He thought about what his father would have made of the ducks, the lanes, Maeve's graph paper at midnight. He thought his father would have been baffled and then persuaded and then proud, roughly in that order, which was more or less how Rhett himself had moved through it. He went back to the field. By the end of the first day, they had covered just over half the acreage. Maeve's soil samples from the completed sections told a consistent story: low to zero larval presence, plant condition healthy, no feeding damage on leaves or stems. She recorded every sample in the composition book in her small, crowded handwriting, numbers and observations packed tight on the page. And when she closed it that evening, she sat with it in her hands for a moment before putting it away. Rhett made dinner. Something basic: eggs and fried potatoes and toast, the kind of meal you make when you're too tired to think about cooking, but you know you have to eat. Maeve sat at the kitchen table and didn't offer to help, which told him how tired she actually was, because she almost always helped. They ate mostly in silence. "Second half tomorrow," he said. "We'll finish by afternoon if we start at first light." "We'll start at first light." She pushed the last of her eggs around the plate. "Rhett, if the samples hold, if everything I've been finding holds through the rest of the field, I know. Every plant. I haven't found a single plant with active larval damage in the treated sections. Not one." "I know. That shouldn't be possible. Everyone who looked at this infestation, the extension office, Pete, Silas, they all said you'd lose 30 to 60% of the crop minimum in a season like this. Even with the chemical programs, Pete's already pulling damaged plants in his south field. I saw his truck going out yesterday morning loaded." Rhett looked at her. "I believe you, Maeve. I've been walking the same field. She stopped, set down her fork. "I don't want to say it and then have it not be true." "Say what?" She was quiet for a moment. The kitchen clock ticked. Outside, the night was very still, the kind of still that comes after extended wind, a held breath quality to the air. "That we did it," she said. "That it worked the way I said it would." He reached across the table and covered her hand with his. Her hand was rough, rougher than it had been a month ago. The skin cracked at the knuckles from the stake work and the wet weather and the endless handling of wire and wood. She turned her hand over and held his. "Say it," he said. She looked at him. Her eyes were tired and clear. "We did it," she said. "The ducks did it. It worked." He squeezed her hand. Then he let go and picked up his fork and finished his eggs. Because there was still a second half of a field to cover tomorrow, and sentiment was something you could afford a little of, and then you had to put it away and sleep. They started before dawn. The flock was at the pen gate when Maeve opened the barn at 5:30. The same thing that had happened the morning before, the same assembled readiness that still slightly startled her even now. She opened the gate and they moved to the field entry without direction, and she thought again about what that meant. About what had changed in these animals over the course of a month that made this possible. They'd started as scared, disoriented birds in a strange pen, stumbling over wire and each other, uncertain about everything. And somewhere in the accumulated work of 30-odd days, moving through the rows, learning the scent and texture of larval soil, navigating by bill and boundary, and the slow education of repetition, they'd become something else. Not smart in any way a person could claim to fully understand, but capable, adapted, suited to this exact task in this exact place. She thought about the word she'd used when she explained it to Rhett 4 weeks ago in the kitchen with the composition book open. They're the right tool for exactly this problem. She hadn't been wrong. She just hadn't known yet how completely right. The second day's work was harder than the first in some ways and easier in others. Harder because the fatigue was real and compound, and no amount of good sleep fully addressed it anymore. They were both operating in that deep tiredness zone where the body performs. But everything takes slightly longer and slightly more intention than it should. Easier because the system was working and they knew it was working, which is a different kind of fuel than hope. They reached the northern rise sections by mid-morning. This was the terrain that had fought them hardest during construction. The clay slope, the tricky junction points, the duck resistance to uphill movement. Without the lane walls, moving the flock uphill required the most sustained whistle work of the whole operation. Rhett and Maeve essentially flanking the flock on the slope and using signals and physical presence to keep them moving upward rather than drifting sideways. 3 times the flock stalled on the grade and had to be reset. The third time, 2 ducks sat down on the slope and refused to move, and Maeve crouched beside them and did the only thing she could think of. She physically lifted the front one, carried it 20 feet up the grade, and set it down on a flat section where it could stand comfortably. The duck shook itself, looked around with its characteristic slow head scan, found the soil interesting, and started working. The second duck watched this happen from 10 feet below, then stood up and walked up the slope on its own. Rhett, watching from the far side of the flock, shook his head slowly. "You carried a duck up a hill," he said. "It worked," she said. "I cannot believe this is our farm." "Drive them forward," she said. "We're burning daylight." The northern rise sections took until early afternoon, when the last group of ducks completed their pass through the final rows near the top of the rise. Maeve walked the whole section with her probe and her notebook, moving systematically from the base of the slope to the crest, checking soil, checking plants, filling in the last entries of the composition book's field survey pages. When she reached the top, she turned and looked back across the whole of it. 40 acres of potato plants, green, upright, unmarked by feeding damage, the leaves catching the afternoon light in that particular way they had when they were healthy. A dense, deep color, not the yellowed or stippled look of a stressed plant, but the clean green of something that had been protected through the worst of its vulnerable season. Behind her, Rhett climbed the last of the slope and came to stand beside her. Below them, the valley spread out wide and quiet, farmhouse rooftops, the county road winding south, the woodlots at the valley edges going full with summer leaf. Pete Murchison's south field was visible from here, and even at this distance you could see the problem. Patches of irregular color in the plant rows, the telltale unevenness of a crop that had been partially damaged and was struggling to recover. The Hendersons' place, further south, looked worse. Their field didn't look like any of that. "I want to count the plants," Maeve said. "Maeve, I need to count a sample. I need a number. I can't put this in the book without a number." "It's healthy. Look at it. Every plant is healthy." "I know it's healthy." She pulled her probe from her pocket. "I still need a number." He stood there and watched her go back down the slope and start her sample count, crouching at each plant, checking stem and leaf and soil, working with the same systematic patience she'd brought to every step of this from the first morning. He watched her and thought about the $42 from the emergency envelope, about the conversation at Wendell Farr's fence, about Clyde Marsh's newsletter and Silas Granger in his good jacket, about the particular kind of person it takes to be right about something that no one else believes, to do the work to prove it without any guarantee that the proof would come, and to carry that uncertainty alone for months before it was ever anyone else's problem to share. She was still counting when the flock finished their rest at the field edge and began moving back toward the barn on their own, unhurried, in the same loose group they'd traveled in all day. 57 birds, going home in the late afternoon light. He watched them go for a moment. Then he went down the slope to help Maeve with her count, because the number mattered to her and whatever mattered to her was worth his time. She was on her knees in the third row from the top, checking root junctions for the telltale scarring that indicated past larval feeding, and she looked up when he crouched beside her. "No scarring," she said. "Zero. This plant was never touched." "What does that mean for the yield?" "Full yield. Maybe better than full. The plants weren't stressed at any point in the growth cycle, which means they've been putting all their energy into the tuber instead of fighting damage." She moved to the next plant. "We might be looking at the best harvest we've ever had." He absorbed this. "The best we've ever had," he repeated. "Possibly. I won't know until we pull." He looked at the row of plants around them. The thick, healthy stems, the ground undisturbed and quiet, the 40 acres of the same thing in every direction. He thought about the bank and the emergency envelope, and the 4 years of narrow margins that had brought them to this field on this afternoon. "Maeve," he said. "I know," she said. She wasn't looking up from the plant. Her voice was matter-of-fact, like she was reading something off a page. But the back of her neck, just above her collar, had gone slightly red in the way it did when she was holding something in. "I know exactly what it means." He sat back on his heels in the dirt and stayed there for a while. Around them, the field was silent in the way that late afternoons got silent. The insects not started yet, the wind gone, the light going golden and long across the rows. He stayed until she finished counting. The harvest came in the second week of September, and it was everything Maeve's numbers had predicted and a little more. They pulled the first rows on a Monday morning, Rhett running the digger along the rows while Maeve followed on foot, checking the tubers as they came up, turning them in her hands, looking for damage and finding almost none. The potatoes were dense and heavy, the skins clean, the flesh firm when she pressed a thumbnail in. No soft spots, no tunneling from larval feeding, none of the hollow cores that showed up when beetles got into a crop mid-season and did their damage underground where you couldn't see it until it was too late. Just potato after potato coming out of the ground healthy and whole. By the end of the first day, they'd pulled 6 rows and filled the truck bed twice. By the end of the week, they'd pulled half the field, and the grain shed was stacked to the ceiling in wooden bins, and the number in Maeve's notebook had gone from projection to fact. It was the best yield the Holloway farm had ever produced. Not by a small margin either. They were running 23% above their previous best season, which had been 4 years ago. Their first year on the property, back before the hard years had stacked up and ground them down. The co-op buyer came out on Thursday afternoon, walked the stacked bins with his clipboard, ran his numbers twice, and told them what he'd pay per hundredweight. When he left, Rhett stood in the grain shed door and looked at the figure Maeve had written on the back of the buyer's card. He stood there for a long time. "That covers the bank," he said. "All of it," she said. "The outstanding balance and the interest. And the equipment account." "Yes." He turned the card over in his hands. "Maeve, we're going to be clear." "We're going to be clear," she said. "And we'll have enough left over to replace the tractor hydraulic line that's been leaking since April, restock the pen properly for winter, and still have operating capital going into next year without borrowing anything." He put the card in his shirt pocket. He didn't say anything else for a while. He didn't need to. The numbers had said it plainly, and they were both people who understood what plain numbers meant. They'd spent 4 years on the edge of losing this place. Every season had been a negotiation between what the land could give and what the debt required, and there had been years when the land lost that negotiation. The farm had survived because they'd been careful and stubborn and occasionally lucky, but always by a margin narrow enough to feel the draft from. That was over now. Or at least, it was over for this season, and this season had bought them room for the next one, and that was how farming actually worked. You didn't win permanently. You won enough to keep going. He looked at the stacked bins, the golden brown potatoes filling the shed with their particular earthy smell, and he thought about the $42 and 63 ducks and a woman at a kitchen table with graph paper at midnight, and he thought that some things were worth being wrong about before you were right. Word spread the way it always did in Frost Willow Valley. By Thursday morning, everyone who farmed within 10 miles knew the Holloway harvest numbers, or close enough to them, and by Friday a small stream of trucks had begun appearing on the county road, slowing in front of the farm, and some of them stopped. Pete Murchison was one of the first. He pulled in the driveway on Friday afternoon and got out of his truck and stood looking at the grain shed with his hands in his jacket pockets, and an expression that wasn't quite embarrassment, but was working in that direction. He was a decent man. Rhett had always thought so. Just one who had decided early in the season that the smart money was on the chemical program and had committed to that position. "Heard your numbers," Pete said. "Grain shed's open," Rhett said. "Come look if you want." Pete walked through the shed slowly, hands still in his pockets, looking at the bins. He stopped at the far end and turned around. "I lost 38% of my south field," he said. "The chemical program got about 2/3 of the infestation. The rest, the deep clusters, the ones in the cooler soil, they hatched late, and by the time I found the damage, it was already done." "I'm sorry, Pete. I spent $640 on pesticide." He said it flat, without self-pity, just accounting. "You spent 42 on ducks." Rhett didn't respond to that. Pete looked at the potato bins for another moment. "How'd she figure it out? The lane system, the whole thing? How'd she know it would work?" "She read about it. Old farming methods, agricultural extension research. She wrote letters to people. She thought about it for months before she said anything to me. She knew before the beetle notice came out, before the beetles were even confirmed in the valley." Pete absorbed this. She saw it coming and planned for it. She saw a problem that was probably coming, thought through solutions, and when the $42 option appeared, she took it. Rhett paused. "She's like that." "Yeah." Pete nodded slowly. "I'm starting to see that." He left without asking anything else, which was its own kind of courtesy. He'd come to look, he'd looked, and now he had to go figure out what it meant for his own operation going forward. That was the honest response, and Rhett respected him for not dressing it up in anything else. But the county fair was the third weekend in September. Frost Willow Valley held its fair every year at the old exhibition ground at the valley's south end. Livestock judging, produce displays, equipment vendors, a pie contest that everyone pretended not to take seriously, and everyone took seriously. It was the kind of event that mattered more in lean years because people needed it more, needed the reminder that the valley was a community, and not just 40 separate operations struggling in parallel. This year, it was a lean year for most people. The beetle infestation had hit the valley hard. Final numbers wouldn't be known until all the harvests were in, but the damage was already visible. Lower yields, stressed crops, a few operations that had decided mid-season to let sections go rather than throw more money at a losing fight. The fair felt slightly muted in the way fairs did when the summer had been hard, the livestock good, but the faces carrying the particular tiredness that comes from a season that gave more problems than it solved. Maeve had almost not gone. She wasn't someone who sought out crowds, and the prospect of walking through an event where she'd spent 3 months being the subject of amused gossip held obvious appeal. She'd told Rhett the night before that she thought they could skip it this year. They had plenty to do before winter prep started. The pen needed reinforcing, the equipment needed winterizing, and Rhett had looked at her for a moment and said, "We're going." "Rhett, Maeve, we're going." She'd recognized the tone and hadn't argued further. So on Saturday morning, they drove to the fair and parked in the dusty field that served as a lot, and walked through the gate into the noise and the smell of funnel cakes and livestock. And within 20 minutes, 3 different farmers had come up to them, people Maeve barely knew by name, to ask about the ducks. It wasn't mockery this time. A woman named Clara Holt, who ran a smaller operation on the valley's western edge, stopped them near the produce tent. She was in her 50s, sharp-eyed, and she got straight to it. "Describe the lane system for me. The willow stakes. What diameter? What spacing?" Maeve looked at her for a moment, recalibrating. 18 inches between lanes. Stakes every 16 inches maximum. Closer in the curved sections. 2-inch diameter on the willow, green not dried, or it doesn't flex properly. Clara wrote this on her hand. "And the duck breed?" "Mixed. The partially sighted characteristic is what matters. They bill forage instead of sight forage, which means they work the soil more thoroughly. But I think any heavy billing breed would work in the lanes. The visual impairment just makes them more reliable because they don't get distracted by surface movement." "Where do you get them?" "I got mine from Wendell Farr on the South County line. I don't know if he has more, but if you're willing to look for the characteristic, You'll find ducks like these at most livestock sales. Nobody wants them. That's why they're cheap. Clara wrote this on her other hand, nodded once, and walked away to find someone to talk to. No pleasantries, no extended conversation, just information gathered and put to use. Maeve appreciated that. There were 2 more conversations like it in the next hour, both from farmers she'd never spoken to at length before. Both of them had questions. None of them were hostile. Whatever the summer's gossip had been, the harvest numbers had rewritten the story, and people in farming communities responded to harvest numbers in a way they didn't always respond to ideas. She and Rhett were at the lemonade stand when she saw Silas Granger. He was 40 feet away, standing with a group of men near the livestock pens, and she noticed him the same moment he noticed her. They held eye contact for a beat. Not hostile, not warm, just the flat acknowledgement of 2 people with unfinished business who have both just realized they're in the same space. Then Silas said something to the men he was with and walked over. He walked the way he always did, unhurried, straight-backed, the walk of a man who'd owned the same 800 acres for 30 years and was comfortable in any room or field the valley had to offer. He stopped a few feet away and looked at them both. "Rhett," he said. "Silas." Then he looked at Maeve. He had a particular look, not apologetic exactly, because Silas Granger didn't traffic heavily in apology. But there was something in his face that hadn't been there at the fence in May, when he'd stood in his good jacket in front of 6 men and told Rhett he was going to lose his crop. "Mrs. Holloway," he said. "Silas." A pause. "I was wrong," he said. He said it the way he said most things, directly, without decoration. "About your ducks, about what you were trying to do. I was wrong, and I said it in front of people who didn't need to hear it, which made it worse than just being wrong privately. I should have said this earlier in the season, and I didn't." Maeve looked at him. She'd spent some portion of the summer being angry at Silas Granger. Not a consuming anger, she was too busy for that, but a low, steady irritation at the particular confidence with which he delivered his verdict. The kind of confidence that doesn't leave much room for the possibility of error. "Why didn't you?" she said. He seemed to consider whether to answer that honestly. "Because I needed to see the harvest myself before I was sure enough to say it. I'm not a man who says he's wrong until he knows for certain he's wrong." A beat. "That's a character flaw, probably." "Probably," she said. Something shifted slightly in his expression, not quite a smile, but adjacent. "The lane system. I've been hearing about it from every farmer in the valley this week. Clara Holt stopped by my place yesterday and bent my ear for an hour about duck procurement." He paused. "Will you sit down with me sometime before the winter and walk me through the methodology? All of it, not just the lane dimensions, the whole thinking behind it." Maeve looked at him for a moment. She thought about the fence and the good jacket and the 6 men and the mallet ringing in the cold, wet dark at 4 in the morning. "I'll sit down with you," she said. "Thank you. But I want you to bring Dora." She said it without particular heat, just as a condition. "She told you it was okay to not know, and she was right. She should be part of the conversation." Silas looked at her for a second. Then he nodded, and something in him settled. Not defeat, not embarrassment. More like a man acknowledging that the territory had shifted and he was adjusting his map. "I'll bring Dora," he said. He shook Rhett's hand, nodded to Maeve, and walked back to his group. Rhett stood beside Maeve with his lemonade and watched him go. "You knew about Dora?" "I guessed," Maeve said. It seemed like a Dora kind of thing to say. "You're frightening sometimes." "I prefer observant." He handed her the second lemonade. The meeting with Silas happened 3 weeks later on an October afternoon when the valley had gone gold and the potato harvest was fully in and the fair was already a memory. They sat at Silas's kitchen table, all 4 of them, Silas and Dora on one side, Rhett and Maeve on the other. And Maeve opened her composition book and walked through everything. Not just the lane dimensions, the whole thinking, like Silas had asked, the original Extension Office research she'd found, the letters to the Northwest Agricultural Programs, the observation about bill foraging in visually impaired birds, the soil temperature monitoring, the hatch prediction methodology, the lane system design and its failures and revisions, the whistle signals, the decision to remove the lanes entirely when the flock had learned the rows. She talked for 90 minutes. Silas asked questions, real ones, the questions of a man who knew farming well enough to find the interesting problems in any approach. He pushed on the things that were genuinely uncertain, the places where the method was still rough, where luck had played a role alongside planning. Maeve didn't oversell any of it. She answered straight and noted the failures as clearly as the successes. Dora took notes. She didn't say much, but she took notes in a small leather-bound book, and she was still writing when everyone else had stopped talking. When it was done, Silas sat back and looked at the composition book spread open on his table. All those pages of tight handwriting and soil sample numbers and sketch diagrams of lane configurations. "You worked all of this out on your own," he said. It wasn't a question. "I had Rhett." "You worked all of this out," he said again, because that was what he meant. "I had information other people had access to," Maeve said. "I just looked at it differently." "You looked at 63 blind ducks and saw a solution," Silas said. "Everyone else looked at 63 blind ducks and saw a joke." Maeve considered this for a moment. "The thing about a tool that looks wrong," she said, "is that it usually looks wrong because people are imagining it doing the job the way the old tools did it. They can't picture a different mechanism, so they look at the new thing and see only its deficiencies compared to what they know." She tapped the composition book. Those ducks were deficient compared to sighted ducks. They were useless for most duck purposes, but for this specific job, soil-level larval detection and removal in a planted row system, the visual impairment wasn't a deficiency, it was an advantage. It made them better than any sighted duck would have been. The table was quiet for a moment. "I've been farming for 38 years, Silas said finally, "and I would not have seen that." "You weren't looking for it," Maeve said. "You had an 800-acre operation and a full chemical program, and no reason to look for something different. We had 40 acres, no chemical budget, and a problem that needed a different answer." She paused. "Necessity is a better teacher than comfort." Dora looked up from her notes. "I'm putting that in the book," she said. Silas looked at his wife. Something passed between them that Maeve didn't try to decode. By November, 4 farms in Frost Willow Valley had purchased ducks. Not all of them got it right on the first try. Clara Holt's first lane system collapsed in a rainstorm in the same way Maeve's had, and she had to call Maeve to talk through the stake driving technique for clay soil. A younger farmer named Davis, who had a small operation near the valley's north end, bought fully sighted ducks by accident and had to start the training process from scratch to get them working the soil rather than the surface. He called Maeve twice about this as well. She talked to both of them for as long as they needed. She didn't charge anything. It didn't occur to her to charge anything. These were valley farmers dealing with the same problems she'd been dealing with, and the knowledge wasn't hers to sell. It was just something she'd figured out that other people could use. Rhett mentioned once that she might consider charging a consultation fee. She gave him the look that meant the conversation was over before it started, and he dropped it. By December, Clyde Marsh had run a different piece in his newsletter, a full column this time above the fold titled "A Valley Method Worth Watching." He described the lane system and its results in accurate detail, this time without misspellings. He referenced the Holloway approach 4 times. He did not apologize for the previous column because Clyde Marsh was not built for apology, but the thorough accuracy of this piece was its own form of correction. Maeve read it standing at the counter, same as the first one. She folded it and put it in the same drawer with the receipts, on top of the first one. The duck pen sat in the barn through the winter, rebuilt properly now. Solid uprights, doubled wire, a latched inner gate that a fox would need human hands to open. 57 ducks, fat from the harvest season and resting through the cold months with the indifferent ease of animals that had done their job and intended to do it again when the time came. Maeve went out to the pen most evenings before dark, not always for a reason, sometimes just to stand there and listen to the collective quiet murmur of the flock, to check that the water wasn't frozen, to count beaks and confirm all 57 were present and settled. It was a habit she'd developed during the hard weeks of summer when the pen checks were necessity, and now that they were routine, she kept them because they'd become something else, something she didn't have a precise word for. The duck that had taken to following her bull, the one with the old scratch scar on her right wing, always came to the near side of the pen when Maeve arrived. She'd press her bill against the wire in that bill-first investigative way, and Maeve would put 2 fingers through the mesh, and the duck would probe them with the same thoroughness she brought to everything. "You're ridiculous," Maeve told her one evening in December. The barn was cold and smelled of hay and animals and the particular dense quiet of winter. "You know that?" The duck did not respond, which was appropriate. Maeve stood there for a while. She thought about the spring coming, the soil warming, the way beetle eggs developed in that particular amber color she'd recognize now from 20 feet away. She thought about the composition book, which had a new volume started, a fresh one, all blank pages, waiting for next season's data. She thought about Clara Holt's lane system and Davis's ducks and the 4 other farms and whatever came after that, the slow spread of a method that had started as desperation and become, in one season, something else. She thought about what she'd said to Silas Granger at his kitchen table. Necessity is a better teacher than comfort. It was true. She'd proven it true in the most specific possible way, with a mallet and a composition book and $42 she probably shouldn't have spent. But sitting with it now, in the winter quiet, she thought the other half of it was also true. The part she hadn't said out loud in that kitchen because it wasn't the kind of thing you said to a man like Silas, or maybe just wasn't the kind of thing she said out loud at all. That necessity only teaches you something if you're paying attention. The valley had needed a different answer to the beetle problem. Other farmers needed it too. They'd all had access to the same extension office research, the same agricultural history, the same possibility of unconventional solutions. The necessity was shared. What wasn't shared was the attention. The particular willingness to look at 63 half-blind ducks and ask not what's wrong with them, but what could they do that nothing else can. That was the actual thing, not the lane system, not the hatch prediction methodology. The willingness to look at what everyone else had dismissed and ask a different question. You couldn't buy that. You couldn't be taught it in a meeting at a kitchen table. It was something you either brought to the work or you didn't, and most people, good people, smart people, experienced people, didn't. Not because they were fools, but because experience often teaches you what works, and what works is usually the thing you already know, and the thing you already know is usually enough. Until it isn't. Rhett appeared at the barn door. "You coming in? It's getting cold." "In a minute." He came and stood beside her at the pen fence. His breath made small clouds in the barn air. The ducks were settling for the night, most of them already tucked up, a few still moving slowly around the pen in the drowsy way they had in the evening. "You're thinking," he said. "I'm usually thinking." "You're thinking loudly." She looked at him. He had his jacket collar up and his hands in his pockets, and his face showed what 4 years of hard farming looked like on a person. Not broken, not beaten, but marked by it. Marked in the good way, the way that meant something had been genuinely lived. "Next spring," she said. "What about it?" "I want to expand the approach, not just beetle control. I've been reading about soil health applications. There's a whole interaction between duck foraging and soil microbial activity that I think we're only scratching the surface of." He looked at her for a moment. "The emergency envelope is still recovering," he said. "I know. We just got clear with the bank." "I know that too." He was quiet for a moment. Outside the barn, the valley was dark and cold and winter silent, the mountain ridges invisible against the black sky, everything locked and waiting for the turn of the season. "How many ducks are we talking about?" he said. "I haven't done the math yet." "Maeve." "I'll do the math. It'll make sense when I do the math." He sighed. It was the sigh of a man who had learned over 4 years that when his wife said it'll make sense when I do the math usually turned out to be correct. That didn't mean it was comfortable or safe or anything other than one more instance of standing at the edge of something and deciding whether to believe in the person beside you. He'd always been able to decide that part. "Do the math," he said. "Show me when it's ready." "I'll have it in a week. Take 2 weeks. Do it right." She nodded. They stood together at the duck pen in the cold barn, watching the flock settle into sleep, 57 animals who had earned their winter rest in the most complete way possible, by doing the one thing they were suited for, in the one place that needed it, without any awareness of what hung on their work, or what it meant to the 2 people watching them now. They didn't know they'd changed anything. They were just ducks. They'd do it again in the spring because that was what ducks did. They followed the work, and they followed the lane, and they went where they were guided, and they put their bills in the earth and found what was there, and they did it again tomorrow and the day after with the same uncomplaining consistency, because they didn't know about debt or community or what it meant to be laughed at and then proven right. That burden belonged to the people. And some burdens, Maeve thought, were worth every ounce of the carrying. She reached 2 fingers through the wire mesh. The duck with the scratched wing pressed her bill forward, warm and searching, in the dark.